By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to design your own horizontal scrolling repeating group inside of Bubble. Now, if you're anything like me, you find the process of creating a vertical scrolling repeating group to be a walk in the park. But when it comes to horizontal repeating groups, it's a completely different ballgame. Well, my job here today is to turn that frown right upside down, because using a blueprint checklist I've created, I'm going to teach you the exact step-by-step instructions you need to follow in order to build a horizontal repeating group with confidence. Look, at this point, I've already rambled on for long enough. Let's open up our Bubble editor and we can dive right into it. Before we jump right into our tutorial today, I just wanted to show you a quick example of what we're going to be creating. So on this demo page, I've just taken the time to create two different types of repeating groups. Now, as you'll see at the top of my page, there's this repeating group that scrolls vertically. So it scales down my page. And within this repeating group, it's just displaying a bunch of different users. And if I was to start reducing the width of my browser, as you'll see, this repeating group will also collapse vertically. So as my browser narrows down, all of these cells are going to stack vertically on top of each other. But then at the bottom of my page, what I've done is I've created a version of this that's a horizontal repeating group. So as you'll see, all of these tiles are positioned horizontally across my page. And in order to view them all, I need to scroll horizontally. Now, the thing about horizontal scrolling repeating groups is that if you reduce the width of your browser, all of the cells don't cascade on top of each other. Instead, they'll get cut off, but thankfully you still have the ability to scroll across and view every single entry. Now, of course, there's pros and cons to both of these styles of repeating groups. But today for our tutorial, we're not going to learn how to create a vertical scrolling repeating group. I'm just going to assume you already know how to do that. In my opinion, they're much easier to create inside of Bubble. But the main purpose of our tutorial right now is to teach you how to create a horizontal scrolling repeating group. And if you're anything like me, horizontal repeating groups scared the absolute hell out of me when I first started using Bubble. I don't know why, but I just really struggled to understand the configurations that separate a vertical scrolling repeating group from one that scrolls horizontally. Now, in the grand scheme of things, you don't really have to change too many additional settings, but what I just found in the past is that there weren't really any good tutorials that break down all of the individual steps that you need to know. A lot of them just assume that you know certain design aspects inside of Bubble, and if I can be completely honest, the official video that Bubble created for horizontal repeating groups is only about a minute long. Now look, in my opinion, even as an experienced Bubble developer, that's nowhere near enough time to explain all of the concepts you need to understand. So this is why I've created a checklist for us within our tutorial today. This checklist breaks down absolutely every step along the way, and we can check each item off as we add it into our Bubble editor. So I guess you could say that this is like the blueprint that we're going to follow. Now, of course, your boy's not here to hog this checklist to himself. I'll be sure to include a link to this checklist in the description of this video, so that way you can make a copy of it and follow along as I tick items off. And so today what we're going to do is start by rebuilding the entire horizontal repeating group you see here from scratch. And I'm going to leave no stone unturned. So let's jump into our Bubble editor here. So this is the existing page that I'd just shown you. Now, for the sake of our tutorial, I've also created a separate page here, which looks the exact same, but it just doesn't have the horizontal repeating group on it yet. And so this is where we're going to rebuild this from scratch. So within my repeating group today, the data I'd like to display is just a list of users inside of my database. So if I quickly just digress and open up my data tab, you'll see I have a user data type, and within this, I have a couple of pretty standard fields. So the main three fields I'm going to focus on showing today is the name of the user, the profile photo, as well as their job title. Now, of course, you can display any information you'd like inside of your horizontal repeating group, but I just wanted to quickly highlight what information I'm going to be showing in my example. So if we now jump back to our design tab, we can scroll on down to our containers menu and add a repeating group onto our page. Now, I'm just going to quickly move this to the last position on my page, so it sits below my title there. And like any repeating group, the very first thing you'll need to do is actually update the data source. So that way Bubble knows which information it should display from your database. So if we jump over to our appearance tab, all I'm going to do is set the type of content here to be a user. Now, by all means, you don't have to display users if you don't want. You can display any bit of information you need. But for me today, I'm just going to perform a search for all of the users in my database, and I'm going to leave it there. It's going to be super straightforward. And from here, this is where our masterclass is going to begin. Right now, this is where I'm going to start following the list of items within my checklist here. So the very first thing I need to do in order to access the horizontal scrolling option is uncheck that our repeating group should be a fixed number of rows and a fixed number of columns. So if we jump back into Bubble here, what you're going to see is that by default, the rows and columns are fixed at 4:1. So right now, this repeating group will only display 4 entries in our database. Even if, let's say, I've got 10 users that I want to show, it's only going to show 4. And that's not the experience we want to create today. I want to display all 10. And look, even if I delete a couple of users and there's only 6 left, I want this repeating group to display all 6. So in order to do that, we need to uncheck that there should be a fixed number of rows. But right now, as you can still see, because we have a fixed number of columns set as 1, this repeating group is still broken down into individual lines. And as you can see, these lines are stacked vertically. And that's because there's only 1 column down our page for our repeating group. Whereas with a horizontal repeating group, you want there to be as many columns as possible, and you want them to be spread across the page, not down the page. So what we also need to do is uncheck that there should be a fixed number of columns. And what do you know from here? We now have this option to update the scroll direction of our repeating group, and this is where we can finally select the horizontal option. And so this is one of the most important things that you'll need to do in the beginning when it comes to creating your horizontal repeating group. If I then jump back to my checklist, we can tick that first item off, and I can see the next thing we need to do is update the minimum height and minimum width of all of the cells in our repeating group. So if I jump back to my Bubble editor, these are the values that you see here, and by default, they're both set to 100. And so what this essentially means is that you're just going to determine the size of each individual cell. So right now, these are 100 by 100, so they're not very large. Now, when I'm working with a repeating group, particularly one that scrolls horizontally, I find that these 2 settings here are the most tedious things to configure. Now, depending on the type of content that you want to display inside of your repeating group, there's no right or wrong dimensions that you can add into these fields. In fact, when I'm creating a horizontal repeating group, finding the perfect dimensions is normally just a matter of trial and error for me. So if you're brand new to Bubble and you don't know what values to add in here, please don't stress. What I normally find is that the values I add in the beginning here aren't always necessarily correct. Once you actually add all of your elements inside of each repeating group cell, you'll get a better idea of the size that each cell needs to be. So you can always come back and update this value in a future point in time. But for our tutorial today, I'm going to set both of these values here to be 320 pixels. And look, there is a specific reason why I've selected 320. And that's because if I was to jump over to my responsive tab here and open up my responsive view, you might not know this, but the smallest possible device size that anyone could view your app on is a mobile that's 320 pixels. And so if you've got any users that live in the Stone Age and still use something like an iPhone 5, that device size is going to be 320 pixels in width. Now, what I find is that most modern devices, like an iPhone 14, 15, or so on, they're all much larger than 320 pixels. They sit around the 380 to 440 mark. But what I want to do today is just factor in for the smallest possible device size. So if the minimum width of each column is 320 pixels, when someone's viewing this at the smallest possible size, each cell of our repeating group will fit perfectly inside of the view. So that's why I'm going to start with these values here, but look, we can always come back and update these in a moment. From here though, I'm just going to jump back to my UI builder. And the other thing I should point out is that the minimum height can also be whatever value you want. So today I've gone with 320 pixels, so that way it becomes a perfect square. But if you've got a repeating group where you need to display lots of information inside of it, you might want to update the minimum height to suit that accordingly. But from here, I'm just going to quickly jump back to my Notion checklist and tick off that we've updated all of those settings. And the next thing we need to do is update the width settings within our layout tab. So this is where we can make the actual repeating group fully responsive. So if we jump back into Bubble again, we're going to open up our layout tab here. And the first thing we'll need to do is just update the container layout of this repeating group. Now, when I'm building repeating groups, I personally like to add a group inside of it, so that way I can add a solid border around the group, like you see within my existing repeating group at the top of my page. So when you add all of your elements inside a group, it kind of looks like this nice little card or tile that sits on your page. And so for the container layout, because I'm just adding one element into my repeating group cell, which is a group, it doesn't really matter which option I select because I'm not actually stacking elements on top of each other. So I can either select between a row or a column. Now for our example today, I'm just going to select the row option, but if you were to select the column option, you wouldn't be entirely wrong. Now from here, here's the fun part. What we're going to do is head down to our width and make this repeating group span across the full width of our page. So in order to do that, we need to follow some basic design principles inside of Bubble. If we want an element to be fully responsive, what we need to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. So when this is a fixed width, it will only ever take up 280 pixels on our page, which is this exact width that you see here. Whereas when I unselect that this should be a fixed width, what we're going to do is set the minimum width to be 0 pixels and leave the maximum width as infinite. So that just means that regardless of the browser's size, this repeating group can be as small as possible, so 0 pixels, or as large as possible, so infinite. And so this is going to create a fully responsive experience for us today. Now we will come back and update the height settings in a moment, but I'm just going to quickly jump back to my checklist and tick off that we've finished updating the width settings within our layout tab. That one was super straightforward. Now below this, we can focus on actually designing all of the elements that are going to sit inside of our repeating group. Now I'm not going to bore you with too many details within my tutorial today, because this is where I imagine your repeating group is going to look different to mine. If you're watching this tutorial, you might have a specific type of information that you want to display inside of your horizontal repeating group. But today for my example, all I'm going to do is add in a couple of fields inside of a group. So I'm going to try and get through this as quickly as possible, but the reason I'm covering how to do this is because there are going to be a couple of key concepts that I need to explain along the way. So as I mentioned, inside of each repeating group cell, I'd like to add a group which is going to house all of my elements. So if I scroll on down to my containers menu, I'm going to grab a group. I'll add this into the first cell of my repeating group. Now for this group, as I mentioned before, I want this to kind of look like a card or a tile. So I'm going to add a solid border around its edges. So if I jump to my Appearance tab, I'll scroll on down to my Styling, and look, today I'm just going to detach the default style, and the reason for that is because I'm just going to set a solid border around this group, and I'm going to set the roundness of its borders to be 10. That's all I need to change there. Now because I'm also going to add all of my elements inside of this group, I need to pass the data from my repeating group through to my main group here, so that way I can reference all of the information of the user that I would like to display. So I'm just going to quickly scroll on up here and update the type of content to be a user. And for the data source, I'm going to set this to be the current cell's user. So that just means that it's going to fetch the information of the relevant user that sits inside of each repeating group cell. So this will be user number 1, this will be user number 2, user number 3, and so on. Now, if you are brand new to Bubble and what I just mentioned was a little confusing, I know I skipped over this pretty quickly, but I'd recommend just doing some research about how groups work and how you can store data in them. I'm not necessarily here to teach you how groups work today. Instead, my main priority is teaching you how to create a horizontal repeating group. Now, the big reason why I wanted to show you how we can actually set up this group is because what we need to do right now is jump over to our Layout tab and first of all, give this group a container layout. Now, as you can see inside of my group, I've got a couple of different elements stacked on top of each other, which means they're stacked vertically on my page. So that means that the container layout will need to be a column. And now from here, that means we'll have the ability to update the width settings of this group. And so I want to make this group fully responsive inside of each repeating group cell. So similar to our main repeating group, all we need to do is uncheck that this should be a fixed width, set the minimum width to be 0, leave the maximum width as infinite, and that means it's going to take up as little or as much space as it can inside of the repeating group. While we're here, I'm also going to scroll down and I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin around every single border for this group. And what that's going to do is create this nice spacing between all of the cells. So right now, they're not going to touch. Now we will come back and update the height settings in a moment, but before we do this, I'm going to add all of my elements inside of this group. And look, this is where I'm not going to bore you with the details. Instead, what I'm going to do is just select all of the elements within my existing repeating group here, make a copy of those, select in my new repeating group, and place those in. But if you want to keep up with my tutorial today, all I've done is I've just copied across a image element, which is going to display the user's profile photo. There's the user's name, there's the user's job title, and then I've just got this button which displays the word follow. And now it's at this point that you can really start to see our group coming together quite nicely. But after I've finished adding all of my elements inside of this group, I'm going to select on the group itself, open up my Layout tab, and I can now set the minimum height of this to equal 0. And so that just means that this group is going to collapse around all of the elements inside of it. And as you can see, I've got 30 pixels of margin at the bottom of this button here. So that means the group will never touch this button. And just like that, that's all we need to configure for this group. So what we're going to do is jump back to my Notion checklist, tick all of these items off, and now we can jump back to the last few settings we need to update to make our horizontal repeating group fully functional. And to be honest, this is probably where most of you are getting stuck when it comes to the process of creating a horizontal repeating group. When it comes to setting up the height configurations, there's a lot you need to factor in. So if we jump back to our bubble editor here, as you can see at this point in time, our repeating group still looks like a vertical scrolling repeating group. So right now it's got all of these cells still stacked on top of each other, whereas that is not the experience we're looking to create today. And the reason why our repeating group is still cascading all the way down the page is because if I select on the repeating group itself and open up our layout tab, if we were to look at our height settings, right now I can see that this repeating group has a minimum height of 350 pixels. So what that's telling Bubble is that at the smallest possible size, this repeating group should be 350 pixels in height, which I can tell you right now, this is far more than 350 pixels. But the main reason why this repeating group is expanding down our page is because it has a maximum height of infinite, meaning that this repeating group can just continually take up as much height as it wants on our page. And that's not what we're looking to do today. Instead, we only want this repeating group to take up the height of one row. And of course, instead of stacking vertically down my page, we want it to stack horizontally. So what we need to do today is create a fixed height on this repeating group. But how can you determine what the height's going to be? Great question, because there's a couple of different ways in which you can do this. If you know the height of all of your elements, you can calculate these together. So for instance, on my image here, if I open up my layout tab, I can see that the width of this image is 100 pixels and it's a fixed value. And because the aspect ratio is 1:1, that means that the height here is also 100 pixels. Now I also have 30 pixels of margin at the top of this image. So if I was to take 100 pixels in height, and add to it 30 pixels of margin, that gives us 130 pixels. Then we'd need to do the exact same thing for every other element. So if I select on the text element here, I can see that I have 20 pixels of margin at the top, and within my appearance tab, the height of this text is 16 pixels. So 20 plus 16 is another 36 pixels. And so you could calculate the height of every single element that sits inside of your repeating group, as well as the margin, and that would get you the exact size of each repeating group cell. But thankfully, in my opinion, there's an easier way to do this. Sometimes you could just do this through a matter of trial and error, but today we're going to take a more specific approach. So if I select on my repeating group and open up my appearance tab, you might remember that at the beginning of my tutorial, I set the minimum height of each row to be 320 pixels. And once again, the reason why I selected this was because the minimum width of each column was also 320 pixels. So right now it is a perfect square. Now, as I mentioned in the past, you can set this height to be whatever value you would like. So if I really wanted, I could set this to be 500 pixels. But whatever value I put in this field here should be the same height as my overall repeating group. So if I jump into my layout tab, I should set the minimum height to be the same value. So it'll be 500 pixels, but I'll also need to make this a fixed height. Now today in my example, I don't really have 500 pixels worth of content to display inside of my group. So that's why there's all of this empty space at the bottom of it. But if I was to select on the group itself and set its minimum height to also be 500 pixels, as you'll see, it'll stretch down my page. But this just illustrates the point I was trying to make before. You can set the height of your repeating group to be absolutely any size. So what I'm going to do is just revert this change. I'm going to select on my repeating group, and I'm just going to show you what happens when I change the value once again. So if I was to now set this to be 320 pixels, I would need to jump back over to my layout tab and make sure my height is also 320 pixels. So within my fixed height here, I'm going to set this to be 320. And what this means by being a fixed value is that this will only ever be the exact height you put into this field here. So if each cell of our repeating group takes up 320 pixels in height, we'll only ever be able to display one cell within this height. So that means that when we can't stack more than one cell on top of each other, all of our cells have no other option but to stack horizontally. Now something I should also point out is that although it looks like it's cut my group off, when you go to run a preview of this, that's not going to be the case. For some reason inside a Bubble, the way your height is designed within the horizontal repeating group here doesn't necessarily reflect the height when you preview the page itself. So if I was to run a preview of this page here, as you'll see, when I scroll on down to my horizontal repeating group, all of these cells fit beautifully inside of it. And of course, this scrolls horizontally. Now before we wrap up this tutorial today, I just also want to show you how you can update the width of each repeating group cell. Because look, I completely get it. I've shown a very specific use case today where the width of each cell is perfectly 320 pixels. So that's why I've got these beautifully square tiles. But look, not everything in Bubble is that simple. Sometimes you might need a lot more horizontal space to display all of the information you need. So that's why I want to quickly jump back into Bubble here and also show you how you can update the width of each repeating group cell. So similar to the height, all you'd need to do is select on the repeating group itself, head over to your Appearance tab, and you can update the minimum width to whatever value you would like. So if I was to set this to 500 pixels, what you'll notice is that my repeating group will automatically adapt to that. And the reason for that is because if you remember, the group inside of this repeating group has an infinite maximum width. So this is fully responsive. It's going to take up as little or as much space as it's allowed to. And when we give it more space, so when we set the width of our repeating group to be 500 pixels, it's going to have no problem taking all of that space up. If I then jump back into my editor and refresh the page, what you'll now see is that each of my tiles here is going to be slightly longer. Now the other thing I should point out is that within my example today, there was a reason why I selected this as 320 pixels. And that is, of course, as I mentioned before, within my responsive tab at the smallest possible device size, when the cell is 320 pixels, as you'll see, a tile will fit perfectly within the mobile device. But look, it's not necessarily the end of the world if your tile stretches past the actual user's viewport. So if I was to select on my repeating group and set the width in the Appearance tab to be 500 pixels, although it does cut off some of my group here, the thing you need to remember about a horizontal repeating group is that you can actually scroll sideways and view more of that information. So if I was to jump back into my preview and refresh this page, and then if I was to reduce the width of my browser and scroll on down, because I'm on a desktop device, this still looks good. So what I might do quickly is just set this minimum width to be something like 700 pixels, which is quite a lot. Then if I refresh my page once again, and now if I was to reduce the width of my browser and just move this into the center of my screen, as you'll see, part of the repeating group is cut off. But to be honest, I'm kind of okay with that, because with a horizontal repeating group, you can just scroll across to continue viewing all of the content inside of it. And so that's one of the pros about using horizontal repeating groups that you don't have with vertical scrolling repeating groups. If you've added a horizontal repeating group into your app, users can almost pretty much expect to have to swipe across to view all of the content inside of it there. And look, that is pretty much everything I wanted to cover within this tutorial today. I truly hope it was helpful. If I just jump back into my Notion checklist, I'm going to tick off that we finished updating all of the height layout settings. And within my additional notes here, I just explained how you could update the width of each cell. The only other thing I should just point out is that if you were to add margins to the side of your actual repeating group itself, you just need to factor that into the actual width of the repeating group. And so what do I mean by that? I'm sure that was probably super confusing. If I jump back into my Bubble editor, what I'm going to do is set the minimum width of my column to be 320 pixels. But let's say if for some reason I jump to my layout tab of my repeating group, and if I was to add 10 pixels of margin on the left and the right of the actual repeating group itself, not the group that sits inside of my repeating group, what you now need to realize is that when you're viewing your device at the smallest possible size of 320 pixels, your repeating group doesn't actually have 320 pixels to display. Because you've added 10 pixels of margin on each size, you need to take 320 and minus 10 minus another 10. So right now the minimum width of your repeating group should actually be 300 pixels, not 320. And so that's something I also just wanted to point out to help you make a truly responsive experience. And finally, the very last thing I should just point out is that if you wanted to remove the scroll bar within your repeating group, so this little bar that you see at the bottom, I've included a link to a tutorial here that I've already created. And look, that is a super straightforward process. So that's just going to help you finalize a repeating group and create a truly beautiful experience for your end users. And just like that, I'm now looking at the new master of horizontal repeating groups. I really hope this tutorial gives you the confidence to start creating your own horizontal repeating groups from scratch. If you found this video useful, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button on my channel, so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop any new tutorials. In the meantime though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.